Welcome everyone to another one of our historical education presentations brought to you by Greece 200 in collaboration as usual with the Sons of Pericles. As always, we encourage all of you to visit our site, which is in the description, and see all the great ways that Greece 200 is honoring our past by building our future in celebration of the Greek bicentennial. Tonight, we complete our two-part series, which we aired part one last week, titled The Greek Revolution of the Diaspora Initiative, where we will discuss the significant contributions of Greek Diaspora members to the revolution. In part one last week, we talked about how the diaspora shaped the new Hellenic identity and provided the resources necessary to begin the revolution. Tonight, we'll discuss the revolution itself, and we'll discuss the diaspora's crucial role in providing resources and leading revolutionary activities. We are joined tonight by our hosts of this two-part series, once again, the District 2 Sons of Pericles. This time for part two of the series, we are hosted by the chapter of Orlando and Daytona. Our panelists tonight are Dimitrios Hill, who is the Orlando chapter president and a junior in high school, Elias Hill, who is in 8th grade and is actually one of our youngest Sons of Pericles members, just initiated this past January. We have Lambros Paspalakis, who's a junior in high school, and Michael Bramblett, who is as well a junior in high school. Thank you guys for joining. And we'll just go ahead and get right into it. To pick up where we left off last week, we ended on the creation of the Philiki Eteria and where and when it started in Odessa. Can you get into more detail on its creation and why it was such an important organization to the revolution?
The creation of the is attributed to three men, Santo Odessa. Although there's a lot of mystery behind its start, some give credit to Mavrokordatos, saying he started the society in Russia, while others trace the Iteria all the way back to Rigas Phidios. The Philiki Iteria, being a secret society, strived to be an underground operation where supporters of the revolution could unite under a common cause, develop strategy, communicate with other revolutionary leaders, and secure the needed funds and resources to wage a successful war. While the Iteria started out in Odessa, it soon moved to Constantinople, which is ironic due to it being the seat of Ottoman power. After the initial leader and founder, Skufa, the Iteria needed a new leader. They first asked Ioannis Kapodistrias, but upon his refusal, settled on Alexandros Ypsilantis.
So now then is a good time to introduce Alexandros Ypsilantis and the entire Ypsilantis family. We know they're incredibly popular revolutionary figures. So Michael, who was Alexandros Ypsilantis and what was his upbringing like?
The Ypsilantis family was from the area of Trebizond, so their origins were Pontian. Alexandros was the oldest of three brothers and had served in the Russian army, where his right arm was torn off by a shell. Dimitrios, the middle child, was also in the Russian army and was a distinguished officer. He was educated at a French military school before his service and is known for his contributions to Peloponnesos during the war. It's Dimitrios that the town of Ypsilantis, Michigan, is named after. The youngest, Nicholas, though lesser mentioned, was consistently fighting in the revolution alongside his brothers, most notably in the early campaigns in Moldavia and Wallachia.
And thank you, Michael. Now with Alexandros Ypsilantis introduced, why did the Eteria choose him to lead, and what were his initial plans once he was appointed as a leader?
Well, originally, the intentions of the Eteria were to start the revolution in 1825. They thought they would need this amount of time to prepare for the war. But soon enough, Ali Pasha, the Pasha of Wanina, began a rebellion. This had the dual effect of distracting the Ottoman Sultan and his forces and inspiring confidence in the Greek people, because the Solyites who helped Ali Pasha had gained multiple victories against the Ottomans. With this event accelerating the process, the Eteria decided to begin the revolution. So the Eteria needed a new leader, and Ypsilantis was chosen. He was considered to be valuable due to his Russian connections, the fact that he had a popular reputation in Greece, and had the experience of high military rank. What will become apparent later, though, is Ypsilantis also often showed poor judgment and was indecisive. He listened very blindly to those around him, despite their sometimes bad intentions, and he often had a false confidence and desire for control, which hurt the cause on several occasions.
And I'm sure we'll see those character flaws come up then and kind of learn hopefully some lessons from those. But moving forward, not only was Ypsilantis a Diaspora member, but the activity he actually took part in, and a lot of the conversation we'll be talking about, is activity outside the borders of Greece. So not only is it by Diaspora members, but it's taking place within the Diaspora. To kick that off, as we'll get into, Ypsilantis's main efforts were in the provinces of Moldavia and Wallachia, which is modern day Romania. Let's discuss his reasons for going there and how things got started.
When Ypsilantis was made leader of the Italia, he made a high-level plan for the war. One of these plans was to provoke a revolt in Moldavia and Wallachia, the point being to inspire rebellions from other Christians in the Balkans and to distract the Ottoman forces and the Sultan. The Italia had many members here, particularly in the cities of Iași and Bucharest, since both cities were full of Greeks and Slavs who held former offices in the Russian and Serbian armies. The Italia also had the support of many Arnauts, which were a group of Greeks, Albanians, Bulgarians, and Serbians who served as bodyguards to the local princes. They joined the Italia and hoped to lend their support to the cause. So Ypsilantis set out to begin his plan, believing that Bulgaria, Serbia, and Macedonia would support the Greek forces, despite the reports to the contrary. Before his arrival, two leaders had already begun revolutionary activity. Yorgo the Olympian led a force in Wallachia. Theodore Vladimirescu led a force to Little Wallachia, and Bucharest was guarded by Bimbasi Sava, who was a Greek leading 1,000 Arnauts.
We'll see I think what we're going to see here is as these get started in the provinces of Moldavia and Wallachia, is Theodore and Sava and Yorgaki are going to be names that we hear come up throughout, and we'll see how their interactions with Ypsilantis affected the revolutionary efforts in those provinces. But before we get into that, Lambros, what I want to ask you is kind of what we found was interesting was the formation of the Sacred Band, which, as you know, I'm sure you'll point out, was a group of young Greek diaspora people. So of course we have some connection to a group like that. And why don't you go ahead and tell us how the Sacred Band got started and kind of what they were?
So the Sacred Band was during the expedition in Moldavia and Wallachia was the formation of the Sacred Band, a group of volunteer Greek diaspora students. The uniform was made of black wool with tall headgear and a white plume with red, white, and cyan. It had a skull and 2 crossbones meaning freedom or death. Because of the black uniforms, they had the name Mavrokordatos. Many grew beards, vowing not to cut until Greece was free. Their flag was red, white, and black, with the phoenix rising from the ashes with the inscription Ektis Konios mu aganomia, which means from my ashes I am reborn. In Foscani, Romania, the students started arm and spear training where they took the oath of the Sacred Band.
I mean, that's an incredibly impressive group that we'll hear about some of their efforts as well. So just again to recap and kind of level set, we're in Focșani, Romania at this point. The Sacred Band has been formed. Ypsilantis has crossed into these territories and is kind of in this area. Michael, we'll go to you next. What happens once we're at Focșani and what are the next moves from here?
While in Focșani, strategies continued and Ypsilantis sent a force to Little Wallachia, partially led by Chiliarch Kolokotroni, a relative of Theodore Kolokotroni. One of Ypsilantis' generals, Bucas, decided to post up in a town near Bucharest, where a number of supporters welcomed him. This became the brief headquarters of Ypsilantis and his forces. When Ypsilantis first arrived, the Arnauts, Bimbashi Sava and others came to pay respects, though Theodore refused. Dukas had to mediate, and Theodore eventually went to meet with him. In a sign of positivity, a Bulgarian captain brought boats and soldiers, announcing Bulgaria's loyalty to the Greek cause. However, at that same moment, Russian Emperor Alexander condemned the campaign for a revolution, removed Ypsilantis from the Russian army, and publicly denounced all association with the efforts. Discouraged, Ypsilantis left Bucharest for Târgoviște with Theodore, who all the while was conspiring with the Pasha of Silistria.
And so we've left Bucharest and now we're in Târgoviște. Elias, what happens once Ypsilantis is over here?
At Târgoviște was where the sacred ban was put into practice. A group of enthusiastic youth, many of whom had left universities in Russia, Germany, and Italy to fight. Unfortunately, Theodore's betrayal became apparent soon after this. On April 23rd, couriers were intercepted proving Theodore's treason, showing his communication with the Pasha with sights of being named leader of Wallachia. Ypsilantis also found a petition meant to be sent to Constantinople to nominate Theodore as prince. Ypsilantis had wasted lots of time persuading Theodore and Sava's loyalty. This wasted any time where the Turks were surprised by the start of the revolt, and inactive Moldavia held better prospects, with Pentedekas leaving Târgoviște and setting up a military government in Iasi. While Ypsilantis had already crossed the Pruth 2 months ago, the Turks had not yet made a move. They began to counter in late April and made their first attack in May 12th in the Battle of Galati. This was where Yusuf Pasha led a strong band of troops to the town and were able to occupy in a couple days, killing the inhabitants that remained. Ypsilantis was in denial of the defeat, instead believing false reports of revolts in Bulgaria and Serbia, and even the appearance of a Russian assistance.
And one of the things that you pointed out, rightfully so, was in the middle of these battles, we're already seeing betrayal, in this case by Theodore. Dimitri, why don't you take us further where we are after this battle of Galati on May 12th, and how betrayal continues to be a growing theme in these difficult efforts that Ypsilantis is pushing forward with.
So on May 27th, Turks take Bucharest without firing a single shot due to Sava and Theodore betraying Ypsilantis and the Greek forces. Sava had left the city before the Ottomans entered and went back to Târgoviște, claiming he was afraid of Theodore. Theodore stayed pretending to defend the city, but intended to cut off the retreat of the Greek forces. Yorgo the Olympian was sent after Theodore for his treason. He wrote an agreement stating that Theodore would keep his faith to the Iteria and raise an insurrection in Little Wallachia, pretending that the revolt would be against the Greek princes. Theodore refused and claimed he had always been loyal and had only abandoned Bucharest out of fear, and that his Ottoman correspondence only meant to be a trap. He was put to death by the Greeks for his treason on June 4th. Târgoviște was later occupied, aided by Sava, who pretended that he was going to the Ottoman side to overtake them.
So, Dimitri, as you pointed out, between betrayal on Theodore and Sava's side and some mistakes that were made on Ypsilantis' side, it seems like things are not going well in the Transdanubian principalities. So, Lambros, will go to you. How do things kind of end here, and where do we start seeing our final battles take place in these areas?
So after several defeats, the Wallachian forces in Ypsilantis made their last stand in the Battle of Dragsani. Ypsilantis had blamed the failures in the war on his troops, saying they were cowards and traitors. Ypsilantis fled the area soon after and left for Austria, expecting to be safe. However, he was arrested by the Austrian government and imprisoned in a castle. He was later released, but died from diseases he contracted while in prison.
And that brings us kind of to the end of the activity in Wallachia. But Michael, as I understand it, Moldavia kind of had a little bit more activity. So let's switch over to Moldavia and kind of see where things end over there.
In the Battle of Dragosani, the remaining forces made their last stand in Wallachia. With no more than 5,000 men to begin with, the sacred band was destroyed. Meanwhile, in Moldavia, near Yasi, the leader of the sacred band abruptly fled and crossed the Pruth River into Russian territory. Despite the desertion and option to retreat, a group of young Greeks between the ages of 15 and 18 swore to fight to the finish. Their bravery was noted as a bright page in Hellenic history.
Potentially the first sons of Pericles, for all we know. So, I mean, it seems like things, unfortunately, aren't going well, but I think we have, some lessons that I see, of course, are the bravery of some of these younger members, which I think is something that we can all kind of aspire to and be impressed by. So, Michael, I think that's well taken. And Elias, why don't you kind of wrap things up in our last kind of action in these territories?
The final action in these provinces took place when George the Olympian took hold of a monastery. Although he was surrounded by Ottoman forces, George declined to flee and defended the city for 36 hours. He finally entered a tower and, vowing not to be captured, lit a barrel of gunpowder, blowing himself up and his soldiers, as well as the Turks who came in after him. Before the stand, George stated, "Let us imitate those true Greeks. If we die like them, perhaps on some future day our countrymen will gather up our bones and transport them to the classic land of our forefathers."
Thanks, Elia. And I mean, those are very powerful words, obviously, impressive and resonant of the Greek spirit, and kind of, death before imprisonment, right, was the common theme that we see. So I think that's well taken. And Dimitri, from your perspective, we talked about these battles and kind of some themes behind them, but overall, what was the importance of this expedition to the revolution overall? What purpose did it achieve?
Well, first, I'd like to say, off of what you just said, I guess kind of it shows the basis of where we as Americans get some of our values from, because the popular saying, "Give me liberty or give me death," that was often used in the American Revolution, it sees its way in the Greek Revolution, I think in a very interesting way that I think is very powerful and very inspiring, especially to us as Greek American youth, as a part of the diaspora. Anyways, on to the importance of the expedition. The expedition, it diverted attention from the Peloponnesian forces and worried the Ottomans of Russian involvement. Combined with Ali Pasha's rebellion, this left the port with little resources, nor the ability to suppress the insurrection in proper Greece.
Yeah, I mean, well said. On your note, Dimitri, that was some good foresight, because we will be discussing, as we get later into the spring, the influence of the American Revolution on the Greek Revolution. So we will see a lot of those tie-ins, and you were very astute to pick that up, and we'll kind of see how that gets tied in later on. So this is kind of the end of Moldavia and Wallachia, but there were other places besides the Balkans where Greek revolutionary activity took place. So Lambros, why don't you tell us, as I understand it, Constantinople also had some activity. Why don't you kind of describe what happened over in Constantinople at the time?
So in Constantinople, a plot was hatched to overthrow the seat of Ottoman power. This was headed by Captain Giusti from the island of Hydra, who planned to deplete the local arsenal, assassinate the Sultan, and seize artillery in the area to arm the Greeks of the city. Giusti was quickly arrested and imprisoned. This led to Ottomans acting swiftly and violently, killing the Greek population, pillaging their homes, and ordering the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, who complied, to excommunicate Ypsilantis and his followers. Many Greeks escaped by sea, and a number escaped to Odessa, which became a home for refugees.
And Michael and then Elias after, I assume Constantinople was not the only place in Asia Minor alone where revolutionary activity occurred. So Michael, then Elia, where else do we see this kind of activity?
Tragedy spanned Europe and Asia, but none more horrible than Smyrna. Ottomans came from the interior of the empire and assassinated Greek peasants, threatening to kill all Christians. This went on for 2 months with reinforcements continuously coming from Asia Minor. Greeks fled, many taking shelter on the islands, 15,000 from Smyrna alone. June 15th, 3,000 Ottomans attacked the Greek quarter of Smyrna, plundering and slaughtering, overrunning Smyrna.
The city of Avali was inhabited solely by Greeks, roughly 30,000 before the revolution. Avali had a college and an enlightened population. Local Pasha sent 1,000 soldiers to the area on the pretext that there was a conspiracy to revolt. They began to massacre and set fire to the houses. All the men were murdered. Women and boys were taken to be sold in the markets of Constantinople. Buildings were burnt, and of the flourishing Avali, there remained but the ashes of its houses and the bones of its inhabitants.
We've heard kind of some activity happening. We've heard some activity happening in other parts of Asia Minor, Constantinople as well. But aside from the actual activities that we've talked about, I'm curious to hear kind of some stories on how various diaspora members, not only militarily but in other ways, affected the revolution. So, Dimitri, what other ways were certain diaspora members kind of involved in influencing the overall revolution efforts?
Well, one of the lesser known but influential diaspora members was a Greek banker of the Moscow embassy named Venesi. He was arrested allegedly because he refused to cash a check drawn by the Prince of Wallachia. The Russian ambassador got involved in his release, and this led to a lot of conflict. This led to an ultimatum by Russia. They asserted that Ottoman actions were interfering with the Orthodox Church as well as the territories of Moldavia and Wallachia. As such, the Russians demanded that the Sultan put an end to the persecution of Christian people, and make a sharp distinction between those who supported the rebellion against the Ottoman Empire and the Greeks who were just passerby.
Well said. Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting story for sure, and something I don't think we hear about often. And I think the last area that we wanted to cover, we've covered kind of military contributions, we've covered cultural contributions, but Lambros and then Michael kind of back to back, who were some people who provided significant political contributions to the revolution and the later formation of the Greek state?
So some of the people were like Alexandros Mavrokordatos, who was a Phanariot who was in France at the start of the revolution. On hearing of the revolt, he went to Marsilius and sailed for Greece to the Ionian Islands. Went first to Melisongi, where he brought with him a number of young French men. Mavrokordatos first went to aid Demetrios Ypsilantis and tried to persuade him to act strongly and decisively. Seeing this was not the case, Mavrokordatos left as far as Arta to work with the Sulitis. He was elected president of the First National Assembly, where the committee was formed to draft a constitution and the Declaration of Independence.
Ioannis Kapodistrias was born in Corfu and studied medicine, philosophy, and law. He was in Russian diplomatic service for a couple decades before returning to Switzerland and promising to raise support for the Greek Revolution. In 1827, he was elected governor of the First Greek National Assembly, which was the first Greek government. At the actual assembly in 1828, Kapodistrias declared the new Hellenic state, and from its capital of Nafplion, combined with the Greek victory at the Battle of Navarino a few months earlier, a new era of free Greece was born.
Great. I mean, I think that's a good place to close off. I think that fully encapsulates, as best as we can on a high level, what the diaspora's contribution was and really how crucial a role it played to the revolution, both before, during, and after. So thank you guys for that. I think one closing question that I have for each of you, and maybe we'll start with Michael and then work our way back through Lambros, Ilias, and Dimitri, just for each of you, kind of your closing thoughts on some kind of highlights you wanted to point out for the audience, things you thought were important, interesting, or just why you think it matters to kind of talk about this subject now. So Michael, we'll start with you.
I think that mainly now that we're in the bicentennial, it's important to remember where we came from as Greek Americans, because oftentimes we see today that many people don't know their culture, where they came from. And just as we celebrate American Independence Day each year, as Greek Americans, we really need to remember, especially now as we're celebrating the bicentennial, where our roots are from. And kind of going through this, kind of just learning all of this information kind of gives us some information about our history. And I just really think that's important in this day and age.
Well said. Lambros, how about you?
So yeah, like kind of like what Michael said, I think it's like important to know like different stuff about our culture and like where we came from, and like different stuff like we need to celebrate just to like be like Greek Orthodox and Greek Americans.
Yeah, I think that's very, very well said as well. Ilya?
I think it's important to know how we were all able to, like all our families, all of our like ancestors were able to get to the point that we are, what contributions and sacrifices our ancestors made for us to be able to come and be at the place we are. And we need to pay, we need to be able to understand, pay mind, and, understand all the sacrifices and all the hardships that people before us made or had to go through and endure to be able to get where we are and be able to talk about the issues and, celebrate that and just understand our history, how we got here, all of that. It's just important to know that and just acknowledge all of that that's happened.
Yeah, I think that's great too. And, just to jump in on that point, Ilya, you mentioned kind of contributions and sacrifices of our ancestors. I think one thing that we wanted to bring out in this topic, and I think we have, is that was a global contribution, right? So when we talk about Greece, we're not talking about a community within the borders of Greece today. We're talking about a global community that still exists now and, was making contributions all the way back in the revolutionary era and is still making contributions today. So I think your point on recognizing those sacrifices and contributions that are being made is well taken, and it's something that you guys are doing now by being the Diaspora members and being involved in the culture in the Sons of Pericles organization and kind of promoting and preserving Hellenism in your heritage. So I think that's a good point, and just kind of want to jump in there. Dimitri, how about you?
So looking over, I guess, the Greek Revolution, I think there's a lot of interesting lessons to be learned. And I think one of the biggest ones that had come out to me was, I guess, recognizing that just because you might have the same common enemy as someone doesn't necessarily mean that they are on your side. And so we can kind of see that with the Greeks, they had several, other countries and people and I guess entities that didn't like the Ottomans, but even though they didn't like the Ottomans and they had a common enemy, in many ways, they were just as much enemies as they were with the Ottomans. And even in response to that, you had other Greeks betraying other Greeks. So it's kind of interesting to me because it really makes you stop and think and kind of really, I guess, question people's true motives. Because just because someone's in charge or someone, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the best interests of the people. And looking back at, these Greek commanders that had betrayed Greece, it really pains me to see stuff like this, because I can't help but wonder, would things be differently had they not betrayed their country? Would Greece have perhaps part of Anatolia? Like, there's a lot of things that we don't know, and a lot of like what ifs. So I think an important lesson to know is, I'd say, just because someone claims to be your friend doesn't necessarily mean that they are your friend.
And I think that's a good point as well. And maybe I will go ahead and ask as a follow-up question, Dimitri, then, if you're willing. How do you see that kind of applying to some things that we kind of deal with in modern day? Where do you see things heading in the future? If our slogan in Greece 200 has been honoring our past by building our future, and looking not only at the last 200 but the next 200. So how does that, we saw what happened in the last 200. How does that apply to the next 200 years?
Me, I think part of it comes from we as I'd say Greek American youth, we'd like to have the best interests of Greece, the motherland, at heart. And I think part of it is recognizing that not everyone thinks the same as us. And so you have, even in America, you have there's a certain allyship with Turkey, and there's an ongoing obvious conflict between Greece and Turkey. And I think that we kind of have to recognize that, just because politically or diplomatically or whatever, everyone's friends per se, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case. So I think, the biggest thing that we can do looking forward in the future is, I guess, just kind of, educating people and spreading awareness of, current ongoing situations in Greece, and even just educating people on the past. There's still parts of the world that, for example, deny that the Greek genocide ever happened. So I think education, and I guess just kind of keeping these stories alive, is, in my opinion, one of the most important things we can do looking forward.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I agree completely, and I think that's very well said. Assuming there are no other closing thoughts, I thank you guys all for your participation. For our audience, thank you as always for viewing. Make sure again to visit our website and kind of follow us on social media, see what we're doing. This does complete the two-part series of the Diaspora's involvement in the revolution. But next week we will have our series starting, or a panel rather, on the Phil-Hellenic involvement of the revolution. So that series is going to be called A Hellenic Heart, Phil-Hellene's Involvement in the Revolution. And thank you guys for joining, and thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next week.